Hello, and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 67. A Great and Furious Downpour. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we covered the reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin, the great victory of Islam over the infidel invader, or, from the other perspective, the fall of the kingdom of heaven to the heathen. And we saw the fear, shock, rage, and guilt that erupted in Europe at the terrifying news, audita tremendi, in the words of the papal bull, and the launch of the Third Crusade. We ended with Frederick Barbarossa leading his armies to the east and, after a predictable dispute with the emperor, crossing the Hellespont and landing in Asia. And today, we will discuss the results of that crossing. Results that were, from the Turkish perspective, absolutely catastrophic. But a catastrophe that, as we will come to see, will ultimately give birth to a golden age. Now remember, as we discussed in prior episodes, at the time that Barbarossa was marching his army east, the Sultanate of Rum was in total crisis. Sultan Kılıç Arslan II was currently in his late 70s, positively ancient by the standards of the Middle Ages. The aging Sultan had been forced to basically partition his sultanate among his 10 sons, while Turkmen unrest had roiled the state. All of this had, of course, led to war, with one of the Sultan's sons, Kutub al-Din Melik Shah, attempting to overthrow his father. A war that had ended mere months before the Holy Roman Emperor crossed the Dardanelles. Simply put, the state was not united under a strong sultan capable of controlling the claimants to the throne or the tribes, or of dealing with Barbarossa. Now, the last time the Crusaders had invaded, the Sultan had been tipped off by the emperor. And even though that did not happen this time, the limping lion was well informed about the Crusader invasion. Indeed, Kılıç Arslan had the best possible source available, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa himself. Contacts between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Roman Sultan went back about a decade, in fact. In 1178, Emperor Frederick had dispatched an emissary to Konya to discuss a potential alliance against the Byzantine Empire. In that case, it was because of his opposition to Emperor Manuel's plan to invade Italy, one of the more delusional throws of the dice by the gambler emperor. Indeed, according to Latin sources, this had even involved a proposal of marriage with the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, and idle talk about the Sultan converting to Christianity. Certainly, just negotiating gambits and unserious diplomatic niceties if this actually occurred. And then, as he was preparing for the crusade, in 1188, Barbarossa sent off a German noble, a man named Gottfried von Weissenbach to the court of the Roman Sultan. Von Weissenbach was to negotiate with Kılıç Arslan and come to terms with him. Basically, make an agreement allowing for the passage of the great crusading army through Anatolia. And this actually makes total sense. Barbarossa's goal was to redeem Jerusalem. He basically didn't care at all about Anatolia. And from Kılıç Arslan's perspective, if the Crusaders wanted to go to war with Saladin, a great rival of the Sultans of Rum, and a man with whom he had, charitably, an extremely tense relationship, well, that sounds great. Go for it. Furthermore, the situation with Byzantium kind of made a Turkish Crusader alliance make a lot of sense to both sides. As we have seen over and over before, there was great tension and hatred between the Latins and the Greeks. Already, many Latins were darkly muttering about who really ought to rule in Constantinople. And if you will recall, the death of Manuel Komnenos had led to war in western Anatolia, with the future Sultan Kehusrev, and potentially even Kılıç Arslan himself, backing the Anatolian pretender Theodore Mangefas. The fall of the Komnenoi and the rise of the Angeloi had also involved war between the Sultanate and the Empire. In the eyes of both Frederick Barbarossa and Kılıç Arslan, perhaps the Holy Roman Emperor and the Roman Sultan were natural allies in a struggle with the Emperor of the Romans. So from the perspectives of Kılıç Arslan and Barbarossa, this whole thing made a ton of sense. Neither side had any real interest in going to war. Both sides had a lot to gain from coming to some sort of deal. A deal that would basically involve payments of gold from the Germans to the Turks in exchange for supplies and the right to march across the territories of the Sultanate of Rum. But here is the thing. Due to the internal instability in Konya, the fracturing of the Sultanate, the weakness of the aging Sultan, and the unrest of the Turkmen, the Sultanate of Rum was just not in a position to make such a deal. And the reason that it was not in that position was, simply put, the Sultan himself was no longer capable of enforcing it. He was no longer capable of exerting the power over Anatolia that would be required to make such a deal work. Both the power over his sons, emboldened and turned into the beys of Turkish Anatolia ever since the partition of 1186, and the power over the wild tribes, now boiling over with unrest. And thus, this whole thing is going to end in tears and in one of the greatest catastrophes to ever befall the Sultanate of Rum. Things actually kind of started going off the rails as soon as Barbarossa and his army crossed into the Byzantine Empire. The Latin continuation of William of Tyre tells us that Kılıç Arslan sent messages to Barbarossa as the Holy Roman Emperor settled into Plovdiv over the winter, writing, "Having sent messengers over to Caesar," by which he means Barbarossa, multiple times while he was staying in Greece, he had encouraged him to come while he delayed there, accusing the Greeks and their ruler of trickery, promising that he would be devoted and faithful to the Christians, that he would make available his resources and his men, and that he would provide both a market for goods and safe passage for all. However, the tensions between the two Christian emperors meant that the Byzantines had detained the Limping Lion's emissary and confiscated the gifts intended for the Holy Roman Emperor. Ultimately, after the two emperors had made peace at Adrianople in early 1190, the Turkish envoy was released, though without the gifts, of course, and managed to link up with Barbarossa on Valentine's Day 1190. The ambassador of the Limping Lion promised Barbarossa safe passage across the lands of the Sultanate. However, in an ill omen, this ambassador was followed just a couple days later by an emissary of the eldest of Kılıç Arslan's sons, Kutub al-Din Melik Shah, currently the ruler of Sivas. Now, we last saw Kutub al-Din Melik Shah leading an open revolt against his father 2 episodes ago. And if you will recall, that revolt had ended with his somewhat inconclusive defeat in late 1189, so just a couple months ago. This embassy promised the emperor passage, but was really focused on making sure that the crusading army did not threaten Kutub al-Din Melik Shah's position in Anatolia. Clearly, the Limping Lion's eldest son was still thinking about how he might be able to unseat his elderly father, and how the arrival of this great Western army might fit into that plan. And I don't want to be too heavy-handed here, but foreshadowing alert. Upon landing in Anatolia near to where the city of Troy had stood thousands of years earlier, Frederick Barbarossa and his army then set out to cross Anatolia. Now, the First Crusade had of course taken the road to Iznik, and from there onto Dorylaeum and across the plateau to Konya. This route had then been followed by Frederick's predecessor and uncle, Conrad III, during the disastrous Second Crusade. However, this route only made sense if you crossed over to Asia at the Bosphorus. It made no sense at all after a crossing by the Dardanelles, which are much further to the west. Instead, the Holy Roman Emperor would follow the route taken by both the French King Louis VII during the Second Crusade and by Manuel Comnenus in both his initial attack on Konya and during the campaign that ended at Myriokephalon. March south down the Aegean coast of Anatolia until you get to the Meander Valley. Turn east and march up the valley and onto the plateau and make for Konya. The plan was to resupply in Konya, have a drink or two with the Sultan, and then march on to the Cilician gates, descend into Cilicia, and then go on to Antioch and the Holy Land. But of course, unbeknownst to Barbarossa, there were certain wild tribes, and a certain Kutub al-Din Melik Shah who might have something to say about all of this. Things started going wrong basically immediately once the Crusaders marched up the Meander Valley and ascended into the mountains of western Anatolia. This area, the area around Denizli and Honaz, near to Myriokephalon itself, was in the porous frontier zone, an area where the rule of the emperor and the sultan overlapped, a place where isolated Greek towns and cities basically existed in a sea of Turkmen bands. Currently, this part of the Sultanate was ruled by the future Sultan of Rum, Kayhusrev I, from Kütahya and Uluborlu. However, these cities and the center of Kayhusrev's satrapy lay further to the east. Instead, the region the Crusaders immediately encountered as they ascended out of the Meander Valley was an area dominated by the wild tribes. Now, as we have discussed earlier, this was a period of great tribal unrest in the Sultanate. A lot of this had been concentrated in the east, particularly around Diyarbakir, where the Turkmen had assembled into a coalition led by a man named Rostam. However, the sources report unrest everywhere in the Sultanate, and, if you will recall, the western part of Anatolia had seen substantial Turkmen migration already. Remember, the Limping Lion had seen his victory at Myriokephalon primarily as providing a release valve for the restless tribes. Send them west to plunder western Anatolia, and thus get them out of my hair. Well, that meant that currently the interior of western Anatolia was bristling with restless tribes. Tribes only barely under the control of the aging Sultan and Khusrev. And it seems that for his part, Khusrev basically decided to stay out of this. He did not attack the Crusaders, but he also doesn't seem to have done anything to control the Turkmen. Thus, as Barbarossa and his crusading army marched into the interior of western Anatolia, they were, of course, set upon by the tribes. The Turkmen did what they always did: set ambushes, conduct hit-and-run attacks, strike from afar, melt away. This, of course, stunned and infuriated the Crusaders, who believed that there was an understanding with the Sultan of Rum, that they would be allowed to march across his territory, and indeed that they would be supplied. And now here they were, faced with constant harassment by the Turkmen. As Niketas Choniates says, as they traveled the inland road, they found that the Turks were not kindly disposed towards them. Avoiding open battle, they robbed them however possible, despite the fact that the Turks had made a covenant with the Romans to allow them to pass through their province peacefully and to provide the travelers with everything they needed. The Limping Lion, of course, sent off ambassadors, assuring the Holy Roman Emperor that the deal remained in place, and explaining that he could not control the wild Turkmen. But here's the thing: the Crusaders did not really understand that. Now, the Roman sultans had a long history of dealing with the Byzantines, of course, and the emperor of the Romans and the Byzantine officials did understand the limited control of the sultan over the tribes. Kılıç Arslan, for his part, likely thought that the Crusaders, just like the Greeks, that is, the Christians he was used to dealing with, understood on some level the nature of his state, and therefore they understood that while he might be their ally, that did not mean that he could force the tribes to be their allies. But the Crusaders were newcomers to the region. Unlike the Greeks, they did not understand the tension between the court and the tribes, or the limits of the Sultan's control over the tribes. And therefore, the Crusaders began to suspect that the Sultan had tricked them, that he had lured them into Anatolia, and now he planned to destroy them. The Latin continuation of William of Tyre really demonstrates this. Listen to how the continuator bitterly describes Kılıç Arslan and the march through the interior of western Anatolia. That wicked traitor had occupied the mountain ridges, forest briars and impassable rivers, and, observing very earnestly the treaty which he had agreed to, he set arrows and stones in the way of those who were about to pass through. This was his market for goods. These were his safe passages. Literally, just dripping with sarcasm. In short, the Crusaders believed that the Sultan had betrayed them, that he had set the Turkmen out to oppose them, when in reality, in fact, Kılıç Arslan had done nothing of the sort. Indeed, he was kind of rooting for the Crusaders here. If they could discipline the tribes on their march to then take on Saladin, the Limping Lion was like all for it. However, the Crusader march through the mountains of western Anatolia and onto the plateau became exactly the sort of bloody slog that you would expect. The Turkmen relentlessly struck at the army, which, remember, was not really experienced in dealing with Turkish tactics. The history of the expedition of Frederick Barbarossa, whose author may well have been on the march, writes bitterly, "Every day the Turks harassed our march with sudden attacks. Like flies or wasps, they swarmed from every hill and fled before we could reach them." Day and night, the Crusaders were subject to this constant harassment as the Turks hunted their prey. The history of the expedition further states that the Turkmen despoiled the wells and the fields in advance of the Crusader army, leading to dehydration and death. And the continuator says of the Turks that they avoided joining battle at close quarters and fighting hand to hand as much as possible, and they shoot missiles from afar. For them, it is no less glorious to flee than to put an enemy to flight. They vigorously attacked each end of the army, now the rearguard, now the vanguard, so that if the narrowness of the place might perhaps divide the army, they would make an attack on the other part. Apparently, the Latins even spent the nights sleeping in their coats of mail to protect themselves from the flurry of arrows that would strike their tents at night. In short, a truly miserable and bloody slog through the mountains. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor might have been able to forgive all of this on some level. Reportedly, the Roman Sultan was constantly sending him messages saying both, "You have to believe me, I cannot control the tribes," and congratulating him for defeating them in battle. And perhaps this might have worked. Maybe the Limping Lion could have found a way to persuade Barbarossa that this was not treachery. But then, basically any chance of that happening ended after the Holy Roman Emperor left the mountains and came onto the plateau in late April, and began approaching Akşehir, the White City, then called Philomelion. Because, of course, there were certain sons of the Limping Lion who saw in the arrival of the crusading army an opportunity to overthrow their father and seize the throne for themselves. And naturally, the first person to take this chance was the Sultan's eldest son, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah. After being defeated by his father and certain of his brothers before the walls of Konya the prior year, Melik Shah had retreated to Sivas. As I said, when he heard of the march of Barbarossa, he sent off his own embassy, an attempt to make sure his interests were protected. But then, as the Holy Roman Emperor crossed over the Hellespont, it appears that Qutb al-Din Melik Shah made his choice. He would ride out to oppose the infidel invader. Defeating the Germans would increase his standing among the Turkmen as the man who delivered plunder and victory. It would burnish his legitimacy as a Ghazi leader of the great jihad against the infidel, and it would also greatly improve his standing with the mighty Saladin. Perhaps the great Ayyubid Sultan would then aid him in an attempt to seize the throne in Konya. Furthermore, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah would make this war in alliance with the wild tribes, the same Turkmen that had aided him in his war with Konya less than a year before. As always, the restless tribes were to provide fuel for the ambitions of the princes of the House of Seljuk. Indeed, in some ways, I think we can see here a dynamic that we have seen over and over before in the podcast: the old cooked versus uncooked barbarian divide. The divide between those Turks who want to stay raw, to keep to the steppe ways, and those who want to adopt the trappings of settled civilization. In short, the court versus the tribes. And perhaps above all, how canny leaders in the court find ways to use that divide, use that tension, to further their own ambitions. Indeed, this branch of the House of Seljuk, the line of Kutalmış, had come to power about a century earlier through doing exactly what Qutb al-Din Melik Shah was now attempting to do himself. This has been a constant in Turkish history through everything we've covered so far. Qutb al-Din Melik Shah thus gathered up his army and as many of the wild tribes as he could. Indeed, he even summoned from the east and the south the so-called Turkmen of Rustam, the same Turkmen confederation that had likely formed in Diyarbakir in the 1180s. He also made an alliance with other sons of the Limping Lion, impatient to see the end of their ancient father, namely the princes of Ankara and Çankırı. Thus assembled, this great army then rode west to confront the Crusaders along the road to Konya. This, then, was the ultimate result of the partition of the Sultanate made in 1186. The Sultan had set his sons up as rulers of Turkish Anatolia, really as basically independent beys. And now, as he continued to age, he found he lacked the power to control them. Against his orders, and in direct violation of his policy, some of them were now riding forth to attack the Holy Roman Emperor. Any chance that Barbarossa would believe his entreaties, believe that this was not a great betrayal, was now shattered. Thus, both the Turkish army of Qutb al-Din Melik Shah and the Crusader army of the Holy Roman Emperor approached the White City. But as the two armies converged on the plains near Akşehir, something extremely unusual for this time of the year occurred. A massive rainstorm appeared from over the mountains, and the Crusaders were forced to huddle in their tents. The continuator tells us, "Such a great and furious downpour fell upon them that the violence of the storm raged within the bounds of the camp. At dawn, when the clouds dissipated, the weather brightened, and behold, the army of the Turks was suddenly all around them with trumpets and drums, and a dreadful noise, and there were so many that neither had their sum been seen before, nor was it believed possible to see so many. Emperor Barbarossa thus saw assembled on the plains not just bands of wild Turkmen, but a proper Turkish army, led by the sons of the Sultan of Rum himself. The Battle of Philomelion was thus joined in May 1190. Our sources sort of differ on the date. The continuator says that it was on May 13th, 1190. Niketas Choniates says it happened on May 1st, and the history of the expedition of Frederick Barbarossa, whose author, remember, may actually have been there, says it happened on May 6th or 7th, which I'm kind of inclined to go with. Regardless, what actually happened is not really in question. Qutb al-Din Melik Shah, who the Latin sources call Melkinus, led his army out in the classic Turkish style. He attempted to break the Crusaders with, you guessed it, hit-and-run attacks and the feigned retreat. Barbarossa ordered his men to assemble into their contingents and charge forward, the natural Latin response which usually led to total disaster. However, as occasionally happened, this time the Franks actually caught up to the Turks. The continuator tells us that this was because the Turks were so numerous and packed so close together that their numbers prevented a proper retreat. Likely, it was also because the prior night's rainfall had turned the normally dry soil of the grasslands in the summer into mud, slowing down the Turkish retreat. The Turks were thus actually forced into hand-to-hand combat, which just was really not their forte. When the Crusaders could actually force the Turks into such combat, the superiority of the Latin heavy cavalry almost always carried the day. Indeed, this is a pretty good rubric for battles between the knights and the steppe riders. Where the battle stays a battle of distance, the steppe riders almost always win. Where the battle becomes a battle of proximity, the knights almost always win. And so it would prove here. The continuator tells us, now the business was close. The fighting was hand to hand. Bows were broken. Arrows did not fly out, and there was barely room for swords. In this way, the throng disturbed everything, and what the enemy had intended to the ruin of our men resulted in their glory. And the history of the expedition of Frederick Barbarossa tells us that the Turks were put to flight with great slaughter. The army of Qutb al-Din Melik Shah was thus crushed by the army of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and the Crusaders' fury at the supposed betrayal of the Sultan in Konya, a betrayal that had not actually occurred, mind you, was now basically unquenchable. Qutb al-Din Melik Shah retreated with the remnants of his army to the east and began preparing yet another stand, while Frederick Barbarossa put Akshehir to siege, quickly captured it, and then set the city alight. As the flames burned behind him, the furious Holy Roman Emperor set forth down the road to Konya. According to Niketas Choniates, though not other chroniclers, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah then prepared one last attempt to defeat Barbarossa before he could get to Konya. Choniates tells us that Melik Shah assembled his armies in the hills at a crucial pass along the route from Akshehir to Konya. Choniates says that Barbarossa defeated this planned ambush with a clever ruse. Apparently, he broke his men into two divisions and had them make camp. When dawn broke, one division rode off in a rush, a feigned retreat if you will, while the other remained hidden in the tents, thus making it appear that the whole army had abandoned the camp. When the Turks rode in to gleefully pillage the camp, the fleeing division of course turned around and prepared an assault, while the division that had stayed behind emerged from the tents and attacked the Turks themselves. In short, the masters of the feigned retreat were themselves caught in a feigned retreat. This basically crushed Qutb al-Din Melik Shah's army, and the eldest son of the Sultan was forced to pull back yet again, leaving the road to Konya clear for Barbarossa. And to say that the Germans were deeply annoyed would be to put it extremely, extremely mildly. From their perspective, the Sultan had totally broken his word and betrayed them. He had offered safe passage, and instead, they had been assaulted and harassed by the tribes in the mountains, and then by the Sultan's own sons on the plains. The limping lion, for his part, was naturally panicking. He sent desperate messengers off to Barbarossa, pleading that he was blameless in all of this. He tried to explain that he did not have the power to control the tribes, and that they had attacked of their own volition, and he disclaimed responsibility for the attacks of Qutb al-Din Melik Shah and his other sons, pleading that they acted without his orders and without his sanction. But the Holy Roman Emperor was of course not willing to hear it. He had had enough with the explanations of the Roman Sultan, and, along with all of the other crusaders, was now convinced that the limping lion was a liar and a traitor. And honestly, even though Kılıç Arslan was not a traitor or a liar here, from the perspective of Barbarossa, does it really matter? Yeah, in reality, he had not played any role in the assaults on the Crusaders. But at the same time, he was so weak, so powerless at this point, that he had not been able to prevent them. He was not a traitor, but ultimately, due to the state of the Sultanate, the aging Sultan was simply not able to uphold the side of the bargain that he had made. From the Crusaders' perspective, his intentions are actually kind of meaningless here, honestly. And now, the Crusaders were done with the Sultan of Rum. The army that was marching to Konya was now an army of conquest. Meanwhile, in Konya, it was clear that there was no force that could possibly withstand the furious Crusaders. Qutb al-Din Melik Shah's armies had been destroyed, and the other sons of Kılıç Arslan, the Seljuk Beys, now ruling Anatolia under the terms of the partition of 1186, had not sent their armies to Konya. Indeed, why would they? What did they have to gain from getting involved here? And furthermore, remember that up until like a couple weeks ago, everyone thought that this was going to be a friendly visit, the march of an ally through the territory of the Sultanate. The armies just were not assembled to fight a war because no one was expecting a war. This was, in fact, a war that had been started by the wild tribes and Qutb al-Din Melik Shah, not a war that Konya or the other Seljuk princes had chosen. Facing this reality, it appears that the limping lion made a run for it. Now, this is not in all of the sources, and there is a chance that Kılıç Arslan II remained in Konya. However, both Niketas Koniatis and the continuator explicitly state that Kılıç Arslan fled his capital. Likely, the limping lion decamped for a small mountain fortification just to the south and east of Konya, a place where he could be in easy communication with both the Crusaders and those inside the walls. From here, he continued to send messages off to Barbarossa, desperately trying to explain that he had nothing to do with what had happened. Messages that were, of course, ignored. Thus, sometime in mid-May 1190, the Holy Roman Emperor made it to the walls of the capital of the Roman Sultan. According to the history of the expedition of Frederick Barbarossa, Barbarossa divided his army into three. One part was to screen against a Turkish relief force sent by Kutub al-Din Melik Shah, who was currently licking his wounds and pulling together his forces in the region. Indeed, as we will get to next time, he was actually preparing for his own assault on Konya. Another was tasked with protecting the baggage from Turkish raids. And the main contingent, of course, was to assault the city itself. The Turkish defenders, already on the back foot, were likely under the command of one of the sons of Kılıç Arslan, though we are not sure which one. They were by now completely outnumbered by the Crusaders and were no match for the disciplined German knights. Nevertheless, they sallied out of the walls and prepared to defend the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. The history of the expedition of Frederick Barbarossa tells us, when our men arrived, they found the Turks drawn up in battle array outside the walls. Without delay, the emperor ordered an attack, and the Germans charged with great courage. The Crusaders thus surged forward, broke through the gates, and seized the outer city. The Turks managed to retreat and hold the central citadel, the semi-fortified hill upon which stood the Alaeddin Mosque complex and the small palace of the Sultans of Rum. For the last time in its history, Konya had fallen to a Christian army. However, instead of ordering the city destroyed, Barbarossa pulled back. His armies did not take the citadel, nor did they even sack the outer city. Instead, the Holy Roman Emperor ordered his men to camp upon the walls themselves, and, with vengeance taken, he finally agreed to negotiate with the Roman Sultan. Why Barbarossa did this is sort of hard to understand. He had Konya at his mercy, and he could have easily overwhelmed the citadel and ordered the city sacked. Certainly, his men would have very much enjoyed the rape and pillage that accompanied the fall of cities in the Middle Ages. But most historians think that ultimately, Barbarossa was focused on getting to the Holy Land. He did not want to lose men on an assault of the citadel, and more importantly, still believed that he could get a deal from Kılıç Arslan. A deal by which he could get the Sultan to provide supplies and safe passage. In other words, even now, he did not understand the limits of Kılıç Arslan's power over the tribes and over his own sons. In short, this is an excellent piece of evidence that he believed that Kılıç Arslan was a traitor whom he had now disciplined and who would now be forced to stick to his side of the bargain. Barbarossa does not seem to have appreciated that, by this point, the Sultan of Rum was simply incapable of enforcing any bargain. With Konya thus effectively in his hands, though with the citadel holding out, Barbarossa finally treated with the envoys of the Limping Lion. In the words of the continuator, the Sultan was pouring all the blame onto his son and declaring himself completely innocent. Entreaties that no one on the Crusaders' side believed. Nevertheless, a deal was soon reached. Kılıç Arslan agreed to hand over a considerable quantity of gold, along with hostages, to secure good behavior, and he promised supplies and safe passage. The supplies were arranged easily enough, but the Limping Lion no doubt knew that by now he had no ability to guarantee safe passage anywhere outside of Konya itself. In exchange, Barbarossa promised to depart quickly for the Holy Land and not to ravage the capital. Soon enough, the crusading army of the Holy Roman Emperor departed from the capital of the Roman Sultan. However, of course, the promises of safe passage were totally useless. As soon as they left the environs of Konya, the area directly ruled by the Sultan, yet again bands of Turkmen began assailing the crusading army. The Germans appear to have been completely stunned by this, and the continuator writes, scandalized. The impiety of the wicked traitor did not subside, for he assailed now with ambushes in the open. The hostages were asked what this was about, and they concocted a lie useful for themselves. For they asserted that these Turks were wild and subject to no one's command, and wandered around with no fixed abodes. Having nothing of their own, they always pursued the goods of others, either by plunder or theft. Even now, the Crusaders simply did not understand the limits on the Sultan's ability to control the tribes, especially after such a grievous defeat. They could not believe that it was not the Sultan who was attacking them, that the hostages were in fact telling the truth. Barbarossa and his crusading army would thus pass through the lands of the Sultanate harried the entire way. Eventually, they would leave the Sultanate of Rum, descending from the Anatolian plateau through the Cilician gates and into Armenian Cilicia. However, in a twist of fate, Barbarossa would not make it to the Holy Land. Instead, the Holy Roman Emperor would drown on June 10th, 1190, while attempting to swim across the river Salef near a castle called Silifike in Cilicia, near to the city of Mersin in modern-day Turkey. His German crusade would not long survive his death. Indeed, the crusade had likely already been substantially weakened by the Turkmen of Anatolia. Now, thousands more Germans would disperse, until ultimately only 5,000 made it to Antioch. And the story of the Third Crusade would instead be written by Philip II of France and Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Meanwhile, back in Anatolia, the Sultanate of Rum was falling apart. Kılıç Arslan's legitimacy had been absolutely shattered by the march of Barbarossa. Everyone could see that not only could he not control the tribes, but he could not even control his own sons. And then the Holy Roman Emperor had forced him to flee his very capital, flee Konya itself, and had taken its walls. The capital itself had fallen to the infidel, and it had only been the forbearance of Barbarossa that had saved Konya from becoming a ruin of ash and toppled stone and blood. Whatever power, whatever authority the limping lion had retained since the partition of 1186 evaporated. And thus, the civil war that had, in a sense, begun in 1189 before being tamped down, would now erupt. And so, next time, we will cover that struggle, a struggle that will open a new chapter in the history of the Sultanate of Rum. And we will bring to the throne the next Roman Sultan, a certain half-Turkish, half-Greek Seljuk prince, now sitting on the western fringe of the Sultanate, in the very mountains through which Barbarossa had just crossed. One of the most fascinating of the sultans to rule in Konya, and the man who will truly begin the golden age of the Seljuks of Rum, Kayhusrev the First.